Purpose of this is just to share again a lot of your insights and your ideas about flow state, and which I've been a student of for many years. So obviously a big part of your life's work has been spreading this knowledge and the tools to help people gain better access to flow states, which can be used obviously for peak performance, but also leads to more well-being, more life satisfaction. I got introduced to your work by Aubrey Marcus and Kyle Kingsbury at On It. And for these guys out there, The Rise of Superman was more than a cult book. It was like a religious book. And so I definitely want to get into some of the mechanics around flow states with you. But before that, I'm really interested and curious in hearing you talk a little bit about how you got started in this journey. So you started your career as an extreme sports reporter, and you lived this very active lifestyle, surfing, traveling, writing for major magazines. And then one day at 30 years old, you contract Lyme disease, which you've described as the worst flu you've ever had, crossed with paranoid schizophrenia. And it's the whole gamut of symptoms, hallucinations, hearing voices. I mean, just horrific. And you're afflicted with this condition for 3 years, which I can only imagine how devastating that must have been for someone as active physically and mentally as you. And then a friend of yours shows up to your door and forces you to go surfing. And you initially push back at this because you can't even imagine walking around, but she keeps pushing and you finally accept to go surfing. And then when you get on the board in the water, muscle memory takes over and you just snap into a different state, a different dimension that you would later discover is a flow experience. And ultimately you go back and you keep having these experiences and you eventually recover from Lyme disease. Now, flow states are usually associated to peak performance or to optimal experiences, but it seems that flow also has therapeutic qualities to it. I mean, do you feel that you were healed by flow in some measure? And how does that work?
It's a great question. And it's actually, so I had sort of seen the other half of the equation, how flow, covering action sports in my 20s, these athletes were using flow to take themselves all the way up to Superman. I didn't know you could go from like seriously subpar, sick for 3 years kind of thing, back to normal. And that was where like it sort of started with me, like, what the hell is going on? The short version, which was true then and is still true today, is two things are important here. First, Lyme is an autoimmune condition. And an autoimmune conditions are essentially a nervous system gone haywire. As we transition into flow, there is a global release of nitric oxide. It's a gaseous signaling molecule. It's everywhere in the body, and it pushes stress hormones out of our system. So this is a really big deal for Lyme for a couple of reasons. One, with a nervous system gone haywire, when you push the stress hormones back out of your system, the system can reset to normal. And if you've been sick with an autoimmune condition for a really long time, your body doesn't know where normal is. So it can't do homeostasis because it's been bounced, it's ping-ponged around for so long. So just by like flushing out the stress hormones, getting rid of the inflammation, your body can reset. And all the neurochemicals that underpin flow, sort of the big five reward chemicals, endorphins, dopamine, serotonin, et cetera, they significantly boost the immune system. So that was known back when I had my experience, and it was mostly work done by Herbert Benson at Harvard, he did some of the foundational work on, well, that's the relaxation response. When the stress hormones get flushed out of your system, it happens in meditation, it happens in flow, it happens in a number of other altered states of consciousness. He did the foundational work. He's a cardiologist at Harvard. He figured that out. He sort of mapped it out and worked on the chemistry. And all this was known 2000 or so when I wrote that book. What is more recent and equally cool, for example, is flow increases our sense of control over our lives. We start to feel more powerful, more self-confidence, self-esteem, all that stuff tends to go up. And we also get a sense of mastery. Flow pushes on our skills. We use our skills to the utmost to get into the state. So we grow and, our skills expand and it increases mastery. Those are two of the most positive emotions that we can get. And what we now know in the field that is neuroimmunology, which is essentially the fancy way of saying the mind-body connection, but it's the field that studies it. Those two feelings, master and control, significantly increase the number of T cells and killer T cells in our body. So these are major infection fighters, anti-aging things. And so all that stuff also, on top of everything I've been talking about, these are more recent discoveries. And then there's also everything that we now know comes off, just like you mentioned that flow amplifies well-being and happiness. And there's a whole bunch of sort of neuroimmunological effects that just spin off of that as well. So our knowledge of the mechanism has greatly expanded. It's interesting. Herb Benson, years ago, and I think in his book, The Breakout Principle, which is his name for flow, said, hey, I think this process, this biology is what underpins all cases of spontaneous healing, or a lot of them. And I don't know if I would go that far, but it is very interesting in the literature. If you start sort of following those cases and looking for mechanism, you tend to see things like flow showing up much more frequently.
It's so interesting how phenomena that would have been considered like new agey and woo-woo back in the day, today when we sort of study them neurochemically, and you talk about a neurochemical cascade that flow creates, right? You see these performance benefits, but you also see these healing benefits sort of come in. It's kind of very, very fascinating how neuroscience, neurochemistry is bringing all those insights to bear.
Let me put it in slightly different context, because this is really interesting. So myself, Dr. Michael Menino, who's a neuroscientist at the Flow Research Collective, Dr. Scott Kelso, who's the godfather of coordination dynamics, and Richard Husky, who's one of the world's leading experts on the neural dynamics of flow. We've got a new paper coming out, hopefully, knock on wood. We have one reviewer to go, but I think it's coming out in the next couple of weeks, on what happens in the brain during the first 2 seconds of flow. So the neural dynamics and neurobiology of flow state onset. And one of the things that we do in the paper is look at a hypothetical thought experiment that compares flow and trauma. And they're interestingly flip sides of this. So one experience goes into flow, and the other experience goes into traumatic stress that could cause PTSD. And it doesn't, that seems a little weird to say it, but I could walk you through some of the thinking around it, and you would get it. My point is that the new work on flow, where it's getting really interesting, is things like PTSD. And so when we start talking about like therapeutic benefits, it's starting to get really interesting in that realm as well, because we're starting to really understand, hey, I just had a high risk experience. Sometimes that experience becomes flow, right? And sometimes it becomes trauma. And it's a very thin line, right? It can go either way. And so the question was, well, why does it go one way this time and the other way this time? And so what the insights give us is both like predictive markers for the onset of flow, which is cool because we've never had them before. But it also gives us a way to say, hey, if this is flow and it's sort of the opposite of post-traumatic stress disorder, how do we use one to take care of the other?
Interesting, because risk is one of the flow triggers that you talk about. So, okay, let's take a little step back, because flow experiences are obviously super remarkable for anybody who sort of studies them even a little bit. And getting into flow for a lot of people is they don't know where to start. It's like what is it? So they've got these common elements, right? Like you have to have clear goals, full concentration on the task at hand, immediate feedback, a little bit of risk, pushing yourself past your comfort zone. So there's these sort of classic flow triggers. But again, for a lot of people, it just sounds very mystical and distant. Like they don't know where to start.
Let's simplify it. Let me add in a little science. And let's start there. So flow states, as you pointed out, have triggers, preconditions that lead to more flow. 22 have been discovered. There's probably way more, but that's what, actually it's probably, I think it's like 24 now, because a couple new group flow triggers just got added. But there's about 24 that we've discovered. There's way more, as I said. They all have one thing in common. So flow follows focus. It only shows up when all our attention is right here, right now on the task at hand, right? That's critical for flow. And that's what all the triggers do. That's what they have in common. They all drive attention into the now, into the current moment. So how do they do this? They do it one of three ways. If you want to increase your ability to pay attention in the brain, you're either talking about producing the neurochemical dopamine, the neurochemical norepinephrine are usually both together. Dopamine and norepinephrine. So dopamine and norepinephrine underpins curiosity, for example. What do you get when you're a little curious? You're paying attention to the thing that's in front of you. You're not fighting it, right? You actually turn up the crank on dopamine and norepinephrine and give somebody a lot of that. That's actually the cocktail known as romantic love. Think about when you're falling in love. You can't stop paying attention to the person you're falling in love with. You can't stop thinking about them. That's essentially what all the triggers do. So yes, there's risk and novelty and complexity and unpredictability and pattern recognition. And what are they like? Okay, that's a bunch of big words. They all produce dopamine and norepinephrine. A couple of the other triggers. So you mentioned clear goals, for example, or immediate feedback. So those triggers lower cognitive load or perceived cognitive load, which are actually two different things. But either way, cognitive load is all the crap you're trying to pay attention to at any one time. And if I lighten your cognitive load, what happens is I've liberated some energy. And the brain immediately repurposes that energy for paying attention to the present moment. So when you have clear goals, for example, I know what I'm doing right now. I know what I'm supposed to be doing. I know what a win looks like. I know what I'm doing next. I know where to put my attention. I don't have to think about it. I can totally focus on the now. That helps us maintain focus. It also lowers, we know what we're doing. So we calm down a little bit, right? And the brain can repurpose that energy. So that's sort of what all the triggers have in common. And the truth of the matter is, different people are more susceptible to different triggers in different environments, at different times of their life, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no one toolkit. There's just sort of get familiar with all 24 of them and how they work, and then apply them. And if you can stack multiple triggers in a row, great. And there's certain things that are sort of a little more commonsensical, but are a little harder to figure out. And let me give you an action sport example. So when athletes are younger, they love using risk as a flow trigger. I'm just going to jump off that cliff on my snowboard and I'm going to be in flow. And sooner or later, you discover that that's like a fast trip to the hospital. You don't do something dumb and dangerous until you're in a state of optimal performance and performing your best. That's when you want to try the risky, right? So don't use risk at a flow trigger at the front end, trying to get into flow. You want to use risk when you're in flow to lengthen the state because you're already performing at your best. At the front end of flow, so risk is this big burst of dopamine, right? Because you get courage and it amplifies fast twitch muscle response, all these things that you need to deal with to take a risk, but creativity. So when the brain links ideas together, right, that's creativity. And we get rewarded with a little squirt of dopamine from that pattern recognition, right? And so think about that same snowboarder can go out into the mountain and start creatively interpreting terrain features. Maybe they're not hitting the big jump for that big, but there's a little side hit over there, and I bet I could throw a 180. I can throw a snow grind over there. Each time you do that creative interpretation, my body could do this with the terrain, that's pattern recognition. So you do 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 of those things in a row, suddenly you find yourself in a flow state without having to use all the risk. And I'll give you that same thing that I just gave. I'm not allowed to talk about which program does this because they're secretive, but I worked with a fairly decent-sized college football program, and they had this question of, hey, can I get our players into flow in warm-ups? Because the idea was they're going to get hurt less in practice if they're in flow. That was the whole idea. Would it work? We didn't know. So and they always, to this particular program, started their practice with a 2-lap run a couple, I was a mile for or 2 miles for the faster players. And it was 2 laps for the centers and whatever. And I said, okay, that's fine, but let's just get it off the track and into the woods and have them run through the woods and creatively interpret the landscape, right? If there's a little hill, they run up the side of the hill and they just bank turns, and maybe they can throw, jump and throw 180s, 360s, literally mimicking the stupid shit you would do on their run. And it seemed really dumb. There was a little there was resistance, right? For the coach.
Was it the novelty factor?
In the beginning, it was just, we're going to take it off road and go into the woods. And that was so novel. It worked. And then as the novelty started wearing off, we layered in more stuff, and it worked. The players got into flow more. What the coaches noticed, the injury rate went down. It wasn't as big as we thought, but what really went up was learning rates, because flow amplifies learning significantly. And so players in flow at the start of practice, like suddenly the window was open far longer for learning. And that was really great. This can also, you could do the same thing. I do it cognitively. When I start writing, I don't like facing a blank page. So I edit what I wrote the day before, because editing is about finding little patterns. And I edit a couple sentences in a row. And now I got a little bit of dopamine. So when I get to the blank page, I'm already closer to flow. I've got a lot of focus. I'm excited. I don't have to, muscle so much to pay attention. It's a better experience and a higher chance of getting into flow. So those are, just a handful of ideas. I hope that clarified it a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's unbelievable that the levels that there are in this flow game. And let's take somebody that listens to this topic and feels like, I've never felt that. I've never felt a flow state. Is it fair to say that it would be maybe more productive for them to start with something that they're very curious about, or something that they're already interested in?
Let me stop you there, because this is what you have. So there's two things we need to talk about. One, what is it? What is flow? How do you know if you're in flow or not? And two, it's not a singular experience, and that's the problem. It would be unbelievable if somebody was listening to this had never been into flow. Everybody is hardwired for flow. It's built in to human beings, and it's how we perform at our best. So if anybody's been in a situation where they've consistently performed at their best over time, they've probably been in flow, but they might not have recognized it, because what most people, when they talk about flow, they're actually talking about an experience known as macro flow. And so let me back in. When we define flow as scientists and psychologists and neuroscientists and whatever, from a psychological perspective, we know there are 6 phenomenological characteristics of flow. Big fancy word that means this is how the state makes you feel. Complete concentration on the task at hand. There's a merger of action and awareness. There's a vanishing of your sense of self. Your sense of self gets quieter, right? Time passes strangely. In fact, when you've been in a car crash, much more frequently it speeds up, and a couple hours go by in a couple of minutes. And we don't experience peak performance on the inside. Instead, we feel 2 things. One, we have this incredible sense of control. Oh my God, I can control things I can't normally control. This could be a basketball player, right, in the zone, and suddenly the hoop looks as big as a hula hoop, right, and they cannot miss. This could be me, 5 a.m. on a Monday. Suddenly, I'm in flow, and the words are doing things the words don't normally do at 5 a.m. on Monday, right? And or it could be businessman or businesswoman leading a meeting, right? And the meeting's going really well, and the questions are sort of one is following the next, and the ideas are bouncing off the wall, and it's sort of a great brainstorming session. That's group flow in action too, and you feel this sense of, oh my God, I'm steering this meeting so well. So that's the sense of control. And finally, flow is autotelic, which is a fancy way of saying this state is unbelievably euphoric. It's joyous. It's addictive. It's so pleasurable. Once we experience flow, we can't wait to do more of the thing that dropped us into flow, because it's that pleasurable. And as you mentioned earlier, people rate flow as the most pleasurable experience on earth, and consistently. It's because nobody ever has a bad time in a flow state. So even all those other hedonic pleasures, sex, drugs, whatever, anybody who's played around in those worlds knows that goes bad as often as it goes good, right? Nobody has a bad time in a flow state. It doesn't go bad.
And there's a hedonic adaptation too, which you don't see with flow. You just want more of the experience, and it kind of builds up. There's that well-being buildup, as opposed to hedonic states, which you sort of keep chasing for that high, and sort of get a diminishing returns over time.
Csikszentmihalyi once said that flow is an addiction, and it's like it's like other addictions, except flow is an addiction that leads forward into the future, because you're always pushing your skills to the utmost, and you're learning and you're growing. He said, unlike other addictions, drugs, sex, gambling, whatever, that tend to lead backwards, right? Same mechanisms. One leads forwards, the other tends to lead backwards, or at least sideways.
Yeah, right. Very interesting.
So there's some people who are just absolutely phenomenal at managing their addictions, and it works for them. And it sort of leads them sideways, and you gotta there's a lot of the modern world that is essentially addiction management. Flow too. Flow is an addictive state. You have to be careful with it in certain ways. And in the same way, it requires some adult responsibility.
You're right. And I think Csikszentmihalyi also talks about an experience that makes the self more complex. So it makes you more differentiated over time.
Oh, you've done your homework.
A little bit.
Right, yeah, so a lot of people don't know this. Csikszentmihalyi did a lot of work on adult development and a lot of work on sort of evolution, adaptation, and things like that. And he has argued essentially that flow is the mechanism for adult development. It's how we grow up. We grow up through flow. To put it differently, there's an evolutionary theory of flow. There's a bunch of ideas about how flow first emerged, but what kept it going and why is it everywhere? And it's not just humans. Most mammals get in flow. So like what did it? And one of the things that we talk about, or that's been talked about, comes off of what you just said, is flow they think is a signal for mastery. So at an internal level, if you're trying to like steer an organism safely through a hostile environment, it's a good idea to like know when you've mastered certain skills. Like, do I know how to fight? Because if you don't know how to fight, you don't want to put your body in certain environments, especially, before the advent of modern medicine, right? Like for sure. So having a signal of, oh, I've really mastered this is actually adaptively beneficial. So there's a whole bunch of thinking that says one of the reasons flow is stuck around for so long and becomes so powerful is that it's this signal for mastery. Oh, you've learned this thing. You can trust that you've got it. And it may not even be, so like it may be a conscious signal, but it's probably a much more powerful signal to the adaptive unconscious. Right. So at an unconscious level, the 95% of the brain that's running stuff behind the scenes, it knows you got this, which is sort of a really big deal.